Hey everyone, welcome to Darshan Talks interviews. I'm your host Darshan Kulkarni. It's my mission to help you trust the products, trust the people you depend on. As you may know, I'm an attorney, I'm a pharmacist, and I advise companies with FDA regulated products. So if you think about drugs, wonder about medical devices, or obsess over pharmacy, this is the interview for you. This is the podcast for you. This is the live stream for you. I do have to say that I am an attorney. I'm not your attorney. I am a pharmacist. I'm not your pharmacist. So this is, and my guest is a pharmacist, but is not your pharmacist either. So this is not legal advice. It's not clinical advice. I also want to say that what we're discussing does not necessarily reflect the opinions of necessarily ours, either the host or the guest, or our employers. So I want to put that out there as well. I do these interviews because they're a lot of fun. I find myself learning something new every single time. So if you like what you hear, please leave a comment, please subscribe. If you're on YouTube, hit that bell icon. If you actually during the talk have questions, please reach out, please ask the questions. Please share the video as well. And if you want to find me, if you want to talk to me, you can find me on Twitter at Darshan Talks, or just go to our website at darshantalks.com. Our interview today is actually really exciting, and we think it's exciting because we've had our guest on several times already, and she is, as always, fascinating. And I thought I had already started exploring the depth of her fascination, her fascinatingness, if you will, until she told me that I hadn't even started, and I have so many points, and I'm going to talk a little bit about them. So if you are into diversity, equity, and inclusion, if you are curious about how does all of that play into patient-centric roles, and if you are curious about just how does a pharmaceutical company think about patient centricity overall, but also in sort of a post-commercialization role. Today's conversation is going to be all about all of those things. Also, I do want to emphasize that she will be speaking at Fierce's DEI virtual event from November 9th to November 10th. I believe if I go to the website, I think it's complimentary. So I will flash that as well. So if you're interested in that topic, please sign up as well. If you think she's interesting now, wait till you actually see her when she's talking with all these other luminaries. Our guest today, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, I should emphasize, she is the CX lead CX lead for patient support services. You can find her on LinkedIn. Our guest for today, Erica Devine. Hey, Erica.
Hey, Darshan, how are you?
I am so happy to be here. I am so excited to talk to you again. And quite honestly, I'm in a place where I feel more comfortable, so I'm really, really excited to be here. So I want to talk a little bit about something you told me, and I hope this is something that you're comfortable saying in a public environment, or else we're in trouble. But I think what you said was that you're one of the first people at Otsuka who worked in patient centricity, and they were trying to figure out how exactly to position you and place you, because it was such a new concept, which is interesting to me because patient centricity has been around forever. And when I say ever, like 20, 30 years. And every 5 years or so, we go, no, now we've got some wind behind our sails. So talk to me a little bit about wind behind our sails. Are we there yet?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so not to say that my organization didn't have people that were doing certain things that were oriented around patients, but to have a role that was built out to specifically focus all of their responsibilities and kind of their remit to patients and understanding patients, I would say is fairly new. So again, I think it's a step in just being able to have somebody that is really kind of corely and wholly responsible for patient experience optimization in patient support. So to talk a little bit about where that role typically is housed, and from my standpoint, sometimes people would think, well, does it fall with advocacy? Does it fall in a leadership type role, like executive leadership role? Does it fall with patient support? Which I have to say, in my own opinion, I think it makes a lot of sense that it falls within patient support, especially when you're looking at where you want to start and prioritize and have the most impact on how you affect patients is really that access journey, right? So when we're looking at post-commercialization, so I want to be very clear about that too. Once the drug's already come to market, and that prescriber or healthcare team provider has decided that that is the right and best product for that patient to treat symptoms or illness, the next part of that is the patient support journey. So how do pharmaceutical companies make sure that it's easy, accessible, to the extent affordable, that they can get it where and when they need it, and really look at it from the patient lens. And so from patient support, and I know for us in our organization, I would guess it would be the same in other industries too. Patient support has the most direct patient caregiver touch points across their function area. So to me, again, when we're looking at the ability to impact and influence, whether it's a good experience or a bad experience for a patient, I think patient support is a great place to start.
So it's interesting. You drew this line that companies in general, your company specifically, when we talk about it, are trying to make sure that products are, when I say products, I mean drugs in your case, but are easy, accessible, affordable. And you guys in patient support are making that journey possible and keeping an eye out to make that possible. How do you address the issue of social determinants of health in trying to address those needs?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a challenging one. Sometimes you have to sit down and say, what are the areas that we can potentially affect? There's certain things that we may not be able to affect, but we can sure try, right? So when I look at social determinants of health, I think a really great bucket to look at is health literacy. I think there's a lot of opportunity for pharmaceutical companies to play a role in making sure that messaging, education, information that is coming out regarding maybe it's the lived condition a patient is living with, or whether it's the product they're on, we have a lot of room to make sure that patients can understand the materials we're putting forward to them. And I would say historically, in my opinion, and I worked as a pharmacist for a good bulk of my career, even though the FDA comes out and says, yeah, this is approved for patient or consumer consumption, we're finding that patients don't understand the words. They don't even understand a lot of how it's presented. So I think there's a lot of opportunities, one, to ask patients as we're looking to create these materials, whether they're access materials, logistical information, whether it's clinical information. I think there's a lot of opportunity here to be able to better understand what makes it understandable to a patient, and can we tailor the way we're messaging some of this stuff so that it sits with the patients much better at the end of the day.
So I have to ask this question, which is, we spend a lot of time asking patients, does this make sense to you? And asking all the types of questions that are patient centric. And I've interviewed some amazing patient advocates who will tell us how important it is that it all happened. But I have to also think about my lived experience. And the vast majority of people I know don't care. To them, they're just going, I go to the pharmacist, he or she gives me drugs, and I go home. Like, why? I don't know why you guys are spending millions of dollars trying to get things to do more when that's not what I need. Drop the cost of the drug itself. So is this an 80-20 Pareto Principle kind of thing, which is 20% of the people care a lot, and that's who we're addressing? Or what are you finding?
So I'd actually challenge that a little bit, Darshan. So
I love it.
So is it that patients don't care, or is it patients have been frustrated with a system that's been put in place for them for a long time, and so now they have apathy to how it is? I would almost challenge that a lot of times patients, and me, I mean, I've been a patient, I've cared for patients. I think they're somewhat apathetic to the process because they don't think that people really include them in the decisions. So I would say, and market research that I've conducted suggests otherwise, that patients really do want to understand their conditions more. They are asking from life sciences companies, healthcare companies, for additional resources and support, but the way in which we do it isn't usually or the best way to do it that really engages a patient. So how do we move a patient from feeling like they don't have control over their treatment destiny to being in the driver's seat and feeling like they're part of the decision making, and that they're not just being run through a system like a cog, a cog in a system, and everybody's just, having their hands at it and, really just experimenting to get them where we want them to go. So I would challenge that a little bit. I do think patients are more interested than we think. I just think it's a very complicated system for them to navigate. And so sometimes people just are like, why even bother?
It's a really interesting point, and I'm going to have to ponder that a little bit. I'm not sure I agree, but I love the fact that you challenged me. This is a comment we just got from Dr. Sarwar. Fascinating conversation. Patient centricity means putting the patient in mind, individualized care, right? Dr. Devine, is your role in clinical trials or post-marketing or both? This feels familiar. I feel like I just asked you that.
No, it's a great question. And first off, I want to say it's equally important in both sides. However, just because of compliance and the way it's really the system is set up for pharmaceuticals, I am in post-commercialization. So once the product has been FDA approved and it's available in the market, that's where I come in. And I think my role and what we're starting to see from the commercialization side is it's marrying patient experience. So really, like, how do they feel when they're going through this experience? What challenges them, what frustrates them, but then marrying those up to kind of these patient reported outcomes. So marrying it with more of that black and white hard data too, that are we also optimizing patient outcomes? And that really comes from, your health economics outcomes research, your real world evidence and value-based function areas. And I think those two, there's a lot of opportunity for them to work together compliantly, but to be able to take that data and really give you a much a larger picture.
So one of the questions I have is, since you work in post-approval and in commercial, if you will, you have a lot of rules on what you have to deal with. The big question I have for you is, your job in many ways is to connect with patients, make their lives easier.
Yeah.
If that's true, how do you find the patients? How does HIPAA play a role in whether you can connect with these patients and whether you can improve their lives? Because I imagine it's hard to find them unless they come out proactively and reach out to you.
Absolutely. So there's a couple different ways, and I'll speak from my personal experience capturing more of that market research, more of that voice of patient, which my types of activities encompass more of those ad boards, or it could be surveys, it could be a whole other combination of those types of activities. But again, of course, you're always getting consent, you're always consulting with your corporate compliance. So legal, ethics, and compliance are heavily involved in that process. But there's a very succinct process by which you make sure that, when you're sourcing patients to participate in these types of programs, that, you've made sure that they're very clear on what the ask is, and that, they understand how you're using the information that they're providing to you, and that they are consenting to the activity, and that they have the right to back out at any time. As far as sourcing patients, there's lots of different ways. A lot of pharmaceutical companies will work through advocacy groups to help them with that. Some will work through recruiters or vendors that work in really trying to capture patient voice and really be able to select the appropriate patients for these types of activities. I think the bigger question is, and I think the more challenging part of this is some of these channels, a lot of times, and you mentioned the 80-20, I think a lot of these channels sometimes get you that 20% of those patients. And if you're really looking to get a more robust representative sample, which is more challenging to do, you want to make sure that you're capturing what I would call the silent patient. Maybe the patient isn't as heavily resourced or even realizes that there's patient advocacy groups oriented around the condition that they're living with. So I think more so the question is, how do we do a better job of making sure that we're getting an all-inclusive voice, not just the most well-resourced voices?
That's a really interesting point. So you see your role not just in helping the patient, but also in informing the patient that they can be helped,
Absolutely.
which is
Absolutely.
fascinating. So, so here's another question for you. So, how do you, in your role in patient centricity, um, work with clinicians?
So again, a lot of times it's through research or ad boards or certain types of market research activities. Again, there's a whole process. So I'm sure Darshan, being the FDA compliance legal mind that you are, and being a lawyer at heart, there is a very separate and distinct set of rules when we're dealing with healthcare providers. So again, you've got sunshine laws, you've got reporting, there's very sophisticated systems at play to make sure that those doctors or prescribers or healthcare providers have been vetted with OIG and other things to make sure that they're clear to participate in some of these activities. So yeah, no, that's usually my engagement with clinicians, though, is really through market research and insight capture.
So my question then becomes: you're speaking at this conference in, well, probably about a week and a half or so at this point. Um, Talk to me a little bit about how your role impacts the types of patients you choose. How do you bring out to ensure diversity, to ensure equity, ensure inclusion, and maybe we can start with what each of those words mean to you in your role.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I almost don't look at it like even all that separate. I look at making sure that we have diverse ethnic, racial, geographical backgrounds, gender, sexual orientation, making sure that we are incorporating people that come from all backgrounds into the mix. Equitable, making sure that they all have those equal opportunities to participate, and making sure that in these inclusion, like when we're looking at inclusion, for me, just personally, it's really making people feel like they're accepted at the table, that we don't prejudge based on, sex, religion, creed, whatever, that people are humans and they're allowed to live their authentic lives, and they're allowed to have experiences that are different than our own, and being very accepting of that. When you're looking at it from a terms of market research, I think one of the biggest things, and I think this is where you look at sometimes doing things right isn't necessarily the quickest way to do it. So, when you're potentially looking at a patient or caregiver population to participate, maybe it's even a healthcare provider, to participate in a certain activity, it's a lot harder to add a bunch of inclusion criteria, right? So the more inclusion criteria we add, the harder it becomes to source those patients because they become a much smaller pool. But I have been very committed with my activities to say those are non-negotiable. So we want to make sure that we have so many people to participate that might be African American, so many that might be Asian. Maybe it's some that are part of the LGBTQ community, so making sure that we're having, not just looking at it from gender or, which is typically what we do, like we want an equal sample of men and women, but really looking and drilling down a little bit further. And I would take that even into geography. Where are they getting their care? So, if we pull them all, because it's easy to pull them all from Philadelphia that are all part of the University of Pennsylvania's health system, we're not really understanding what's going on in Wyoming, so really looking at where people are getting care to, and either the amount or lack thereof of community support services that are in those areas that impact their ability to access care. So a long answer, right? But it's a complicated question. I think it's a complicated question.
It's a very complicated question. I do want to point out, Ellen actually commented, to expand on Darshan's comment, we also need to educate the physicians and HCPs that the patients can be helped. How do you actually play a role in that? Do you, or is that a role for people in sales, for example, or medical affairs? How do you see that?
So I think it's tackled from a couple of different ways. And Ellen, I think that is a wonderful question, because a lot of times I think even allowing, like, we have different schools of thoughts in it when we look at prescribers or when we look at healthcare providers. Some are very much like, I went to school a really long time for this, and I know what's best. So this is kind of how I approach treatment for patients. Some are more, you're starting to see a little bit more of a temperance to say, this is the person who's actually being impacted by the treatment I'm prescribing, or the treatment or therapy regimen, whatever. They should have a say in how they want this to be done, So absolutely, I think, but to the second part of Ellen's question here regarding how do we tackle educating healthcare providers that patients can be helped, and patients have a lot of influence and they have a lot of say in how things are done, is, okay, you've got the sales, right? Sales typically talk more to the clinical aspects, the prescribing information, clinical aspects of a product. So absolutely, clinical education is super important. But I think from a patient support standpoint, we need to start making sure that we're letting doctors know, well, this is the part of the journey that your patient can do. They just need to understand how to do it. And so while we're here to also help educate your patients to understand, this is where they can get their treatment administered, for instance, we're also arming the healthcare provider to be able to say, okay, this is the part that the physician or the patients can play in accessing their treatment. And this is the part that I have to do, right? Because some things have to fall to the provider in order to move things forward, whether that be prior authorization or, step edit or whatever we're talking about. So there's certain parts that can't really fall to the patient. But then, let's say the prior auth gets denied, or they can't get the treatment they need, but the physician still thinks that's the best product for them. Patients don't necessarily know that they can appeal with their payers, right? And a lot of people don't understand that appeals are different than prior auth. So, I think it's more so chunking down the logistical steps, because it's super complex. And a lot of times patients are just dumped with all the information at one time. And so it's very hard for them to separate it out and digest it and say, okay, now I know what I need to do next. And then I'll know what I need to do next once I hit that step. It's just, it's very complicated. If it's complicated for me, I can only imagine it's very complicated for patients and healthcare providers alike.
So what I need to ask is, obviously the problems you're describing are not unique to any individual company. This is just, how does the healthcare system work, and how do you as a patient need to navigate this? Is there any kind of effort that you're aware of where companies are working together to say, patients, go to this website and you will learn how to navigate the healthcare system around reimbursement, for example?
No, it's a great question. And I think sometimes those partnerships are predicated more on centered around the product, right? So you might have partnerships that are co-licensing or can start to look at creating joint materials, right?
Right.
But I do think there are ways where pharma companies are coming together and they work through advocacy. So while the partnership isn't necessarily from company X to company Y, company X, Y, A, and C are all going to patient advocacy group 1, and they're all kind of signing on or sponsoring or supporting a same initiative that's being disseminated to a patient. So I think those partnerships happen. They just happen a little bit differently. And I would be guessing it has to do a lot with compliance considerations, maybe legal ethics, potentially.
No, I would argue it's actually, from a compliance standpoint, I don't think it's actually that big a deal. The bigger issue, I think, is the fact that it's hard to actually get a bunch of companies to agree. Having said that, I'm part of multiple groups where that does happen. So the question really is, and it's natural to go to patient advocacy groups for the most part, because that's a place where you're safe and you know that they have the patient's best interest at heart, which makes it easy. The problem you have with that is the idea that you now have patient advocacy group 1, and then you have to reduplicate it for patient advocacy group 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. And it's the problems you and I are talking about are not disease specific. They're not drug specific. These are healthcare reimbursement problems. And it feels like in many cases across most drugs that as an industry, we tend to solve the problem for ourselves and don't look at, well, we're just reduplicating the effort that the other company just did. I mean, it's not just in the context of reimbursement, right? You could say the exact same thing in the context of clinical trial training. Like one of the things that I deal with is every clinical trial, every principal investigator goes, how many times do I need to relearn how to do like look at a patient? Like I understand GCPs. I've been doing this for 15 years, but every sponsor comes in and tries to teach me GCPs. Yep. And from a sponsor perspective, I get it because you're trying to cover your behind.
Yes.
But you're ignoring the reality of the situation. Do you find that this area is ripe for someone to go, we need to solve this problem consistently across multiple groups?
Sure, absolutely. I think it is ripe for disruption. You said something really important, though. I'm going to take a couple steps back. So when we were talking about just partnership across organizations, and I can give an example of this, but I think you said something very important, and it's true. It may be able to happen, but it's hard. It's hard. Right. So just in past experience, not with any organization I'm with now, I worked very heavily with corporate sponsors, and we had a group of them that we met with monthly, right? And we had tried this multiple times. So, all of the companies that sat on our council were like, we need to address financial barriers. We got really far down the road, and what ended up happening was there was a huge concern that it could potentially look like drug pricing or price fixing. Right. So it's always like this very fine line. And I think it goes to risk tolerance and maybe risk mitigation. And so sometimes I think, to your point, it's hard. And is the juice worth the squeeze at the end, right? Do you continue going down this path, potentially putting yourself at huge risk? Or do you follow the same path we've kind of been doing, which is tackle it one individual at a time? And if we get enough people doing it, maybe the volume will speak for itself. I don't know. But I think you also see it in government too. And I'm no expert in like government affairs, but I think that's another space where you see multiple companies coming together that will back a certain initiative. And it is usually to the benefit of the patient, but it's usually also to the benefit of the industry member. So it's almost like it has to be a win-win, right? But no, I think it's a great question. And I think, back to, do we need disruption? Absolutely. And I'll take this back to an article that you were so kind to share regarding, COVID, for instance. The whole situation with the pandemic created a more patient-centric, I think, experience and acceptance. And the question was, did we do it because it was the right thing to do, or because we were kind of strong-armed into it? And I think it's a great thing. One, yes, I think, necessity always breeds resourcefulness. I think we have to look at it not just from pharma or from healthcare, but as a world as a whole. So because there were no choices in it anymore, patients didn't have the choice to either go on camera and meet with their doctor or go in face to face. It was like, if you don't go on camera, you're not seeing your doctor. So I think for us, the lack of choice and the urgency to come up with solutions to the major problem we were all facing also helped create this acceptance for change. And so had that immediacy not have been there, I think, it would have taken us years potentially to get there. And then people are like, well, is it really worth investing all this time trying to get telemedicine off the ground when it's going to take us 5 years to get patients even engaged with Skype or Zoom? So, I think the opportunity and the urgency created the environment we're in. But I also think it let up a little bit where we weren't so concerned about what's in it for us. It was like we just had to make sure we could serve patients, and there was a crisis at hand and we had to do it. So I think everybody kind of relaxed a little bit and said, well, that's the priority here and we're going to get it done.
That's awesome. As you know, I usually aim for these to be about 15, 20 minutes. We're at 30 minutes and in 19 seconds. So
Woo!
we're a little bit over, but you're always fun to talk to. And that's just normal. So I appreciate you taking the time. As you know, I'm going to ask you 4 questions. The first question we've been asking and we've been sharing the whole time, which is how can people contact you? And that's right on the screen right there, which is your LinkedIn profile. But here's the second question. What would you like to ask the audience?
I'm going to ask it again. What do they want? What do they expect from pharmaceutical companies? What is one thing a pharmaceutical company could do to make your life or day living with a condition or your loved one living with a condition better?
I will answer that. I don't know what I answered the last time then, but I'll answer it now again. Have a more centralized location of resources.
Love it. Love it.
Yeah.
And I hear you loud and clear.
Fair enough. Here's another question. This is a new one, by the way. I just started asking this question. What is something most people don't know about you?
That actually, well, there's 2 things. I'll do one fun and one serious. So one thing, I'm actually quite introverted. So
are you?
Even though I'm social and I love talking and meeting people, I also very much like to be alone. So it's funny. My husband and I laugh about this all the time. Like I am the first one to be like, go away for the weekend. Yeah, take the kids. Like I do really like being alone too sometimes with my own thoughts. So I would say I'm definitely a mixed hybrid. And 2, I used to be a diver. So I dove for the University of Pittsburgh 20 years ago.
Wow. How good were you?
I wasn't very good. People would not know that to look at me today, but
I don't know. You have diver shoulders. Based on what I can see on the screen, but that's awesome. I was a athlete as well, a long time ago.
Ooh, what'd you do?
I was U.S. number. I had a national silver in the U.S. in the American Athletic Union in judo, and in India I was national bronze. So
that is so cool. See, I get to learn something about you too.
I guess
I might have to see some of these moves one day.
Believe me, no one wants to see them. It's been a while. Having said that, I do practice right now. I just started it back up, so that's always fun. So here's another question for you. What's something you've learned in the last month?
Ooh. So I started intensively taking my BCACP credits to keep my certification that'll be up in 2024. That is much, much harder to do when you're not working directly in clinical practice.
Why bother?
I feel like it keeps me on the pulse of what's happening clinically. So even though I'm not doing it, it's really important to me to understand and know what the most recent guidelines are. Just something to kind of keep my foot still in the.
It grounds you.
In the side of pharmacy. Yes, absolutely.
Fair enough. I keep thinking what licenses I want to get, and then I start thinking about how many more C credits I'd have to do, and I just go, I don't know if it's worth it. What's something that made you happy in the last week?
We all went to a hockey game. We went to the Pens game on Saturday night, and it was awesome because both my kids are like old enough to sit that long, and they all everybody just really enjoyed it. Plus the Pens actually beat the Maple Leafs, so we were really happy about that.
Where are you based?
Pittsburgh.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Okay. Because you're like Maple Leafs. You're really going hardcore with Canada and everything there.
Yeah. No, it was a home game.
Fair enough. I have a comment from Janan. Darshan's point on resources is great. PI plus MedGuide is good. But patient videos, especially of devices, centralized would be great from pharma. One of the comments that I actually didn't get to, but I wanted to raise was: has there been much discussion on number one, educating HCPs through CMEs? And my second question is: has there been any kind of discussion on creating CME-like products for patients so that they can learn from a educational perspective? So are these conversations that are happening?
So I'll address the first one, and I just want to say that that is a really great point down below. Videos, things that can be smaller and more, like, they're more engaging. And I think depending on the audience you're looking at too, some people really resonate more with a visual and an audio versus just like a print material. So having complementary pieces, I think, is so important. But two, so the question around CME, and I would almost have to defer maybe, Darshan, to you regarding the compliance. But what I've always remembered, and I'm just thinking back when I was a pharmacist, way back in the day, I could go to like speaker programs and earn CME or CE. You can't do that anymore. So pharma, at least on the to my knowledge, on the promotional side, you cannot, like, you're much more, it's more stringent on what you can do. The way, at least from my experience in advocacy and working with pharma partners, is you can sponsor medical education. But again, usually that is created by an advocacy or a professional home. So you are the sponsor, you're funding it, but it's not necessarily your own content, which in a way I think is kind of good, because it kind of keeps this impartial, unbiased lens to what you're putting out there. So that's really the only way I know it's being done. Could be done differently, and I may just not be privy to it, but that's how I know.
No, I think you're right that it does have to be sponsored. You cannot have the actual control of the CME itself. Having said that, I was wondering whether there's discussion about sponsoring. For example, I'm making this up. Sponsor X is going to pay for a sponsorship so that physicians hear what the patient perspective is like on XYZ drugs, or just in neurology, which is just not a conversation I've ever seen had.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know that I don't know about the credit question. Like, are they able to apply it to medical education? But I do know that even my organization has websites open to healthcare providers, PsycU, Nephew, that are oriented around a healthcare provider audience. As a pharmacist, I go there a lot. There's actually a pharmacist corner resource. They even have patient caregiver resources on those sites. They're awesome. And again, they're really led more from a healthcare provider, like a medical advisory board, not really from like the organizational side.
Fair enough. This is awesome. As usual, we have gone well past time, but Erica, this was as usual an incredible conversation. I hope you'll consider coming back again, because this was a lot of fun. I already have. Janan comments. I currently work for CME Outfitters, where content is sponsored by pharmaceutical grants. More pharma are asking for HCP training with patient perspectives. There we go.
Awesome.
So that's interesting, though. She says patient perspectives, not necessarily patient-centered, if you will, for lack of a better term.
Yep. That's interesting. And again, my experience in a previous organization, and especially when you get into the professional home, because that was really where I was more in a healthcare provider association society, it was a lot less where you had direct patient perspective incorporated into those training. But we at that time was starting to incorporate that more. So we were looking at potentially almost patient advisory panels that could also serve in lending patient perspective or experience around oncology, for instance, or something like that. So absolutely, I agree with that. I think could we be doing more of it? Absolutely. I actually really I like that perspective.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Erica. This was great, and we'll talk soon.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you.